Virginia, and we represent a rate-paying constituency of folks in Virginia that have either gone solar or believe that solar is the best way, or are planning to go solar. They believe it's the best way to create jobs, build clean energy into our power grid, and give consumers energy choice. So just wanted to speak on a few things that might be apropos to the energy plan and some of the discussion today. A lot of our constituency is really recommending solar coupled with battery storage on distributed solar installations, rooftop solar installations as they're often called, as the best way to create resiliency strategy here. We're seeing data from places like Puerto Rico, Florida, and we're also seeing in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, states and municipalities proactively plan distributed solar with battery storage as a resiliency strategy. And that's just something that really needs to be considered. Additionally, what our constituency is also emphasizing is that as a precursor to resiliency strategy in local energy is the reduction of barriers to customer-owned solar in Virginia, specifically arbitrary limits on key incentives like net metering, also discriminatory policies like standby charges and system-sized limitations on private property. These are all things that actually have no data to warrant their necessity, but they discriminate against solar homeowners, business owners, and more specifically, contractors that count on those policies to bring them jobs. So just wanted to respectfully underline that. We're seeing, again, a big push for a modern grid as well. Part of that modern grid as a cornerstone is rooftop solar. As we transition to a two-way democratic energy system that's resilient and customer empowered, we have to think of rooftop or distributed solar as a key component of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Erica Bardwell. I'm from Arlington, Virginia. I am a Sierra Club member. I'll be commenting on the power plan in general, energy plan, excuse me. And I just wanted to say that the choices made for the plan don't just have technical or economic consequences, they do end up having moral implications. As a registered nurse, I know that fossil fuel powered generation literally poisons people. Soot gives little kids asthma. It puts old people in the hospital, or sometimes worse than that. Coal ash stored in ponds gets into water that had been clean. And I don't have time to even get into the horrors of exposure to fracking chemicals. I'd only make the point that they're proprietary, which means that if somebody gets exposed, they're actually a secret from the victim and from the people trying to treat them. And also the real threat from fossil fuels is one that I think we skip over because it's almost too scary to contemplate, which is the ultimate results of climate change. As it progresses, we're going to be looking at crop failures, cities underwater, just an endless stream of crises with no end. And I think we just look away from that fact because we can't wrap our heads around it. And for these reasons, we need to commit to building absolutely no new fossil fuel infrastructure and phasing out what we have. This probably sounds radical, even crazy to many of the people in this room, but I'm going to go ahead and mangle something said by Einstein, which was that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing while expecting a different result. If we keep building fossil fuel infrastructure, we're going to get worse climate change. That's just how it's going to be. So we must commit to energy conservation, and we have to commit to 100% renewable energy as quickly as it's technically achievable. To do anything else is what would be radical, irresponsible, dangerous, and I would say that from the standpoint of future generations, it would be incomprehensible and unforgivable. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. I'm Brian Kaufman. I'm with Enernoc, a part of Enel, which is based out of Rome, Italy. I flew down here from Philadelphia this morning, and proud to be in the Old Dominion with a lot of relatives nearby. It was great to just listen to that meeting. I'd love to tell my friends up in Pennsylvania about this organization that started here a few years ago and what you're trying to do. As a commercial developer, we have hundreds of customers here in Virginia Virginia that right now are participating in wholesale market programs. PJM, the grid operator for the Mid-Atlantic, is headquartered right outside of Philadelphia, and helps balance the load here in Richmond. Our customers are helping keep the lights on, especially during reliability events such as the polar vortex in 2014, 2015. These customers reduced their demand at the times when the grid, all the lights almost went out, and helped to maintain the system. These customers who are earning a check every month by participating in programs here in Virginia as part of PJM, a lot of them would really love to also use energy storage and solar to provide grid benefits and also help maintain their own costs and all the other benefits that you're hearing other people talk about. So that was my perspective really from a commercial developer, and just looking ahead, would really love to stay involved and ask that you look for the perspective from customers and people who are trying to maintain manufacturing in the state, people who are trying to create jobs here. And we have programs in other states nearby that have received benefits from states, some incentives for those kind of reliability benefits that solar and storage provide. We have a public housing complex where we coupled storage with solar, and through benefits, through incentives that the state provided, that was really helped to get this market off the ground and showcase some new technologies. So that's really the opportunity. Some of the challenges we see, and your study that you're doing here, I hope you'll help uncover some of these issues. There's a lot of some really smart people who are studying these issues in the state and other places. Interconnection is one of those big issues. We find that customers really have trouble working both with their local utility and then also the wholesale market to get projects done under cost constraints, and sometimes there's a lot of replication of studies that have to be done. Some jurisdictions have really figured out how to streamline those processes and also cut down on the time. We all know that time is money. Another big impediment is that utilities tend to think about wires, and this grid of the future really is thinking about wires, but also thinking about how to do things without wires. You'll hear a term, non-wires alternatives, around. A lot of other states are starting to think about this, and I think Virginia could really do a lot of good work. Especially you see so much load growth in Northern Virginia, and this whole non-wires alternatives sector is looking at, let's see, is there a cheaper option to do an upgrade to a substation rather than tearing up highway, building a new infrastructure? Can you actually build storage or solar energy efficiency, other tools that can help reduce the demand at peak times so you don't need to actually make that investment? It's a different way of thinking, and I think it's a real challenge to how things have been done, but this group has a lot of power to really change that and make investments that really will pay off for decades and decades. So I'm going to close with that, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. Rachel Smucker, Secure Futures. I'd now like to draw your attention to the two Secure Futures documents in front of you. And for those of you who are on the phone and anyone else in the room, I'm happy to make those documents available to you all. I'd just like to highlight a few points from that first document regarding solar jobs. In 2016, according to the National Solar Jobs Census, there were just over 260,000 solar jobs in the U.S. 3,000 of those jobs were held by our fellow Virginians. Based on NOAA statistics, Richmond and other cities have experienced a 1.5% increase per year of our cooling loads due to climate change. Now, if Virginia were to commit to producing 10% of residential electricity consumption from solar, we could not only hedge against the effects of climate change, but also create over 50,000 new jobs here in the Commonwealth. Achieving the 10% goal would require the solar industry to build 15,000 megawatts of solar. Going back to the National Solar Jobs Consensus of 2016, it shows that approximately 69% of total solar jobs in the U.S. were in the residential and commercial market segment, while only 31% were in the utility scale market segment. As you can see here, there are huge economic impacts that result from distributed generation solar because those projects tap into local talent and local sourcing at a higher rate than the utility scale projects. Companies like Secure Futures would support and fully advocate for a balanced approach to meeting the state's solar needs. We can't just survive on utility scale solar. We also need residential and commercial scale solar to truly tap into our greatest job and economic potential. Thank you.
Members of the board and DMME staff, thank you for having this public comment period. Building on what Rachel alluded to, the 1.5% increase in cooling load per year that we're witnessing in Richmond and other cities in Virginia, it's sort of like being lobsters in a pot. It's starting to feel uncomfortable, but we're still kicking around. But sooner or later, the results are not what we would prefer. So perhaps I would like to suggest that this is the year for distributed generation. For the last 2 years, the well-known Rubin Group has done an extraordinary job in advancing utility-scale solar, and we applaud those efforts. We would suggest a balanced approach this year. And you heard the reasons that Rachel mentioned as the paramount value of distributed generation. It creates a lot of jobs and investment, and importantly, investment from mainstream. I'd like to call your attention to the Virginia Solar Energy Development Authority 2017 annual report that cites under authority activities on page 14 that one of its purposes is to advance commercial solar. And I quote partially to say, expanding third-party ownership options beyond utility pilots and all parties, and encouraging all parties to participate. I bring this to your all's attention because this is a very key way to help advance distributed generation. As many of you know, Dominion established through the legislature and negotiating in good faith with the solar industry to develop a PPA pilot program with a 1 megawatt cap and 50 megawatts overall. APCO followed shortly thereafter with a 7 megawatt program limited to institutions of higher ed. So I think those are two examples of pilot programs that need to be expanded. There are currently no PPA programs in place or projects in place in APCO territory. Dominion PPAs are now registering at 7.3 megawatts on the SEC website. That grew about 5 megawatts since January of this year. We see a hockey stick formation, and we know between ourselves and other developers in Virginia, we will very likely hit that cap of 50 megawatts by the end of 2019. So again, bringing back the lobsters in the pot, it feels all right now, but it'll be extremely uncomfortable for the market and for all players concerned as we approach that cap. Even at 40 megawatts or 35 megawatts, it'll create market uncertainty where both customers and developers will say, hey, it's not really worth our effort because of the uncertainty to proceed, to incur those engineering costs, those other soft development costs. So well before we reach that 50 megawatt cap next year, third-party PPAs will likely grind to a halt unless we change the rules. So we would propose that the rules be changed to increase the project size to 2 megawatts and the overall cap to 200 megawatts. And in the meantime, ask the SEC to engage in some analysis on terms of renewing the caps altogether. We don't really understand a reason for a cap. Related to that, we probably also need to address the net metering cap of 1 megawatt. Which is currently 1 megawatt per project, or 1% of peak demand. Currently, Dominion is at about 10% of that peak for net metering, and APCO at about 25% per DMME statistics. We would propose increasing that cap to 2 megawatts per project and to 10% of peak demand, and at the same time encourage SCC staff to conduct an analysis on removing the caps altogether. I'd like to end my comments with just one suggestion that we need a both-and solution here in Virginia. We need both utility and distributed generation. I, for one, can't fathom why we can't revisit the business models for utilities. Those utility business models are based on 19th century business models, which is really not serving us all that well today. I would suggest a business model approach where utilities are incentivized to invest and support distributed generation. We're all smart enough, and certainly members of this board are smart enough to engage in some productive conversation about how we can change the incentive structures. So we would propose that among the things that the Faceta Authority take on this year is to actively explore what would it look like. How could we approach a more balanced approach to utility and DG investment to bring in Main Street and Wall Street if the utilities are incentivized to invest in DG? Thank you.
Did my affiliation with the Sierra Club. And I have left a long comment already on your website, so I'm going to try to keep this short in the interest of everybody in the room. It feels like every time there's a discussion of energy policy, whether you listen to Republicans or Democrats, state level or federal, it is all of the above. That's what we need. And I believe that's true. We need the diversity, but what we see is pretty much all of our energy eggs in one basket. We lay pipeline and we continue to support these same polluting, non-clean, centralized systems. And what I'd love to see to make our grid less vulnerable, more decentralized, more diverse, if we really had that all of the above, if we really believed that, we would have evidence of that. Our state buildings, our schools would have solar rooftops, solar panels. We would have incentivized community solar all over our state. And we see other states moving in that direction. And I would love for us to really commit to the idea of all of the above, not just give it lip service. And as others have said, it's good for job promotion, it's good for security to have a decentralized grid, and it's good for democracy and clean energy for the future of our children and grandchildren. I thank you.
Members of the authority, staff from DMME, thank you all very much for holding this hearing session today. I'm going to confine my commentary today to talking specifically about storage and its dynamics, as I think this is one of those rare opportunities to provide that particular insight and input into the larger Virginia Energy planning process. And I'll start by commending this authority and the state for really starting to think about storage, starting to tackle this in a big way, as Virginia Advanced Energy Economy, which represents a diversity of advanced energy businesses located both in Virginia and across the country and around the world. So renewable developers, energy efficiency and demand response providers, storage manufacturers, electric vehicle manufacturers, and large corporate buyers. We're encouraged to see states engage around this policy because we think that the price point and the technological sophistication of storage is rapidly approaching where we saw solar a few years ago. And this is so critically important because there comes a juncture at which that price point, and this was brought up, I think, by Mr. Rust in the conversation a little bit earlier, you get to a price point where you have price parity between existing sort of traditional resources and these new resources that are coming on the grid. And when you reach that tipping point, you can have a dramatic transformational change. So having the state understand when that's going to happen, the abilities of storage in order to adapt for that is really critical to being able to adapt and take advantage of that technology in as fast a manner as possible. And to talk about why we think storage technology is so revolutionary for this system, I'll go to an analogy. I'm not an engineering expert. I look to our businesses who really understand this technology in depth. But the best analogy that I've ever seen to understand the revolutionary potential of storage is something like this. We build our grid today sort of like we build shopping mall parking lots. We build them, and we only use about 10% of them about 90% of the time. But the day after Thanksgiving and the day before Christmas, they're packed to the gills, and every space is full there. Our grids are made in a very similar way, and we made that because in the 19th and 20th century, the only way to go about ensuring that people could have power at reasonable levels was to have a hub and spokes model. You'd have large centralized generating units creating energy at economies of scale and then piping that out to folks through large transmission systems and ultimately distribution systems, the wires that run into our homes. The problem with that is that you have to pay for all that infrastructure. You've got to pay for every one of those spaces in the shopping mall parking lot year-round, regardless of whether they're getting used or not. Storage means that we're actually able to roll up that shopping mall parking lot and pay for a fraction of that amount when we use it. So here are the two areas that I'll provide specific commentary around, because I think this is important as we think about moving forward in the RFP and then ultimately sort of the legislation that I hope will, and regulation that I hope will come out of this. When it comes to the RFP, I would hope that we take that full spectrum of benefits that storage is able to provide into account. Both the ability to defer transmission and distribution resource infrastructure, the ability to defer the need for additional peaking resources because it can serve as a supplement to peaking resources, the ability to defer the need for centralized resources to meet intermittent resources as we integrate more renewable and distributed energy into our systems. There are a host of costs that come along with all these things, and the ability to drive down on those costs, to retain those, and not necessarily have to pay full freight on those, I think that's an extraordinary benefit to the ratepayer. And so having a process, an RFP, and a study process that ultimately looks and fully quantifies all those benefits and factors them into account, I think is important. Ultimately, I think what we'd love to see come out of that study is an assessment of various possible system-wide sort of deployments of storage and looking towards what's that optimal economic scenario there, where we're able to get to a place where we're providing the maximum benefit, the maximum savings to ratepayers, while also helping to reduce emissions and increase resiliency in that process. So we think there's a lot that can come out of that. I'll make just one other very quick note about that. I think what's implicit in that, obviously, is that you need to bring somebody on board for those consulting purposes who have the technical wherewithal to really do that analysis and quantify those benefits, because they are such tangible economic benefits, but we're moving into a relatively new technological future. The only other thing I'll add about that study is we would hope, we know how the study is sort of proposed and how the financing is obligated around that. In talking with folks who work in the storage field routinely, what they've told me is the financing could probably be increased around that, but that the time span, the 2-year time span, is probably longer than it needs to be to effectively conduct a study of this nature, that this could be done in a more compressed time span. So what we'd ask and what we'd hope for is that this study, the ultimate results of this study, are completed by the end of Q3 of next year. And I think that carries you into the next fiscal year, so you're able to use the entirety of that financing. But that allows us to inform legislators and regulators before the 2020 legislative session, so that Virginia is able to move effectively and move swiftly towards necessary legislation. So I know I'm taking a lot of time here. I want to make certain just to emphasize what we think some of that legislation might look like in 2020 and beyond, with the hope that it's likewise reflected in the Virginia Energy Plan. One area that we'd really love love to see storage factored into, and I think we'll probably need a legislative change in order to do this, is that as our utilities go about conducting integrated resource planning, and they think about the resources in this grid, that they look really specifically to storage. We know that in the most recent Dominion IRP, we saw storage referenced, and there was a brief discussion of it, but it ultimately wasn't included in their bus bar curves. That was a disappointment. We think that, in fact, storage is already at a point where it's economically viable, and certainly going forward, it should be modeled out in the future. Having a greater level of awareness of how it can be utilized, especially within the distribution system, will help going about doing so. But having a more explicit IRP statute that requires storage to be modeled in that, so that we are looking at those options, I think will yield better outcomes for ratepayers. The other thing that I'll emphasize as well is I think as we move into a more distributed future, it's important as well when there are proposals, especially around the build-out of peaking generation and transmission and distribution, that there's a study done to assess whether or not storage and related distributed energy resources can be utilized as an effective alternative, and that the onus should be placed upon those proposing to make large capital investments to demonstrate why storage and other distributed energy resources coming in generally at a fraction of those overall costs cannot necessarily be utilized. So I'll contain my remarks at that. Again, really appreciate the authority taking the time to think through these things. There's a lot of potential here, and we're really excited about the future.
Ed Wrench, R-O-E-N-S-C-H. I'm a citizen, but I'm also a volunteer with a nonpartisan organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. Someone said, well, why isn't solar on the top of the buildings here in the State House and at the universities? There's one simple reason. It's cheaper to use coal and gas and oil to generate electricity at this moment. Now, what can we do to make, or maybe I should say, how can we include the true social cost? And that's the term that our friends at the National Academy of Sciences call social cost, is not being included in the generation of electricity by gas and oil and coal. Now, what do they mean by that? I hate to bore you, but I'm going to make a list here of the things that they included in the social cost. Government subsidies, increased illness and mortality due to mining pollution, climate change from gas house gas emissions, particulates causing air pollution, loss of biodiversity, cost to the taxpayers for environmental monitoring and cleanup, decreased property values, infrastructure damage from mudslides, from mountaintop removal, infrastructure damage from mine blasting, impacts of acid rain resulting from coal combustion byproducts, and water pollution. Now, what did they come up with? They came up with about $60 a ton. What I'd like to see, and our friends at Citizens Climate Lobby, is to impose a tax. Now, we call it a fee, but doggone it, it's a tax. And then refund that totally to each household based on the use in a certain area of electricity, and start at a small amount, not $60 a ton of carbon, but started at like $10 a ton, and that gives planning the ability of businesses and people to plan for the future, that this is going to cost more, and you need to do something about getting off of the use of non-renewable carbon sources for energy. And eventually work it up to the point over a number of years, to the point where obviously it's going to be cheaper for people to use solar than to use these other non-renewable carbon sources as the ones that develop the electricity. Excuse me. It's estimated that the cost, one of the little details I read, is that they think that the cost of electricity generated by coal should be about 3 times what it is right now. That's an estimate. It could be more than that, but that's what they estimate. What can we do otherwise? An example is in the state of California. What they've done is they've said by 2020, all homes are to be designed as zero net energy. And by 2030, all buildings. Now, what does that do? That obviously incentivizes the use of solar. What else can we do? Mandate that all homes and buildings for sale, I know the realtors are going to love this, report, what do they say here? The DOD Building Energy Asset Score. I think 75 is what you want to see. Or for a home, the Home Energy Rating Score, it's called HERS, H-E-R-S. Obviously, that's going to give someone that goes out to buy a house or a building, they get an idea of how energy, I think the term is something like energy intensive of the building or the home before you ever think about buying it. Right now, that kind of information is not available, to the best of my knowledge, not in Virginia. Now, this is just a detail here, but I think all utility companies should credit the value of any excess electricity generated by renewable sources at the retail value. There are some places I know from what I've read in other states where what they do is they say, well, we'll give you credit on retail value up to what you actually use, but then anything above that, why, we're just going to give you the wholesale value. Well, what that does is it disincentivizes you to put in more solar because your return on investment is going to be much, much longer. So I think I don't know what it says in Virginia, but that's what it should be. As others have already talked about, I think we should transform our major utilities to function as a rechargeable electrical storage battery, and where they would provide electricity in case there was a problem with the other sources of electricity, or it was being used, there was maintenance being done. Now, obviously, during certain times of the day or year, when energy is greater demand, I think we ought to have to pay more for it. Or we should be notified that we're going to have to pay more for it, so we can do things like turn our thermostat down if it's during the summer, or do whatever we can to reduce our energy use. We should know about that so that we should be charged more for where it's into greater demand, but we should have the option, we should have the information and have the option to say, well, we're going to do things to reduce our energy use. That's not going to be easy, but with the state of art of our computer systems today, I don't know why we couldn't do that. Lastly, I'll leave off that last one. Okay, that concludes my remarks. Thank you very much for your time, and if you're looking for a consultant, not me, I'm not in the area, Charles Ely, he wrote a book called it's a long name, Design Professional Guide to Zero Net Energy Building. Naturally, he's out in California, but I think he might be, I read his book, and I thought that it was extremely good and very up-to-date. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
To speak with you. I've seen and met some of you before at previous meetings. As I sat near the James River, I live near the river, I watched car after car loaded with coal going to the plants to burn, to produce our electricity, and I decided it's time for me to do something about that. So I tore down an old single-car carport. I built a 24-foot by 24-foot carport. I contacted 3 installers of solar panels. None of them would give me any more energy than what I used in the previous year. I bought an electric car. I plan to put total electric energy in my house, so of course my next year's usage would be much greater. Dominion is not my friend. So I contacted somebody in Northern Virginia, Ipsen, and they said, well, we can sell you any amount of panels you want. He even went to bat for me and got permission from Dominion to put in 28 panels to give me, my peak is 6.4 kilowatts. I put them up myself. I did all of the permits, the inspections. I ran the wire to my box, but an electrician had to connect it. He charged me for it, and I started. I am now running the meter backwards. I do give Dominion credit. I told them when I was finished, I sent in my form and application, and within 3 days, they had my net meter installed. I'm very pleased. My last 3 bills were $8.40. One bill was $0, and to me, that's just great. I didn't go into it for the economy. I did it for the environment, and I feel very good about it. Thank you very much.
Battery storage for the purposes of informing the energy plan. And just to quickly put battery storage in context with other resources, battery storage specifically, not storage generally, where Virginia, as we all well know, is catching up in the solar generation side of things, and catching up on the offshore wind side of things, and catching up on energy efficiency technology as far as where a lot of the other states are, and also catching up on grid modernization efforts, whether it's smart meters, time of use rates, peak shifting, things like that. Battery storage is a place where Virginia can actually be ahead of the curve, or at least at the curve. Although I should point out, as a West Virginian myself, West Virginia is currently beating Virginia when it comes to batteries, utility scale battery storage. So I do want to throw that out there. If that lights a fire underneath us, you don't want to be behind West Virginia. So the question, to quickly speak to why storage, why battery storage, basically to lower overall costs by as we know, shifting peak and better integrating low cost, but sometimes variable resources, both solar in the near term, we know we're rapidly ramping up on that, and offshore wind and terrestrial wind in the longer term. Just like we've already seen with solar and wind, storage costs are dramatically falling. The sort of precipitous decline in the cost to deploy this technology fell by 50% just in the last 2 years. So that's the sort of decline we can expect to continue seeing. So let's jump at or ahead of the curve. To briefly speak on how best to do that, for starters, integrated resource planning reform. Dominion did not include, it was a somewhat sweeping omission of not including battery storage, particularly when we know that we're looking very seriously at grid modernization. That is a pretty glaring omission not to include battery storage in the forward planning analysis, because why modernize the grid if you're not going to take advantage of battery storage and all the benefits it provides. Consider requiring an alternatives analysis as far as pairing solar with storage. So if someone comes in with a good solar proposal, perhaps include a requirement that they at least look at the possibility of pairing it with solar, either upfront or somewhere down the line, just so we know what the added benefits and or upfront costs of that would be, because currently we don't necessarily do that, and that's a bit of an omission as well. I would also, just as an institution and thought leaders, I would keep a close eye on the grid modernization docket over at the State Corporation Commission as Dominion pursues those investments, ensure that as part of that they do maximize battery storage in tandem with just grid modernization modernization generally. And lastly, I would express a note of caution about additional pumped storage facilities in Virginia without fully understanding their costs relative to battery storage. We have Bath County, that is a large and in-use facility that Dominion uses presumably to the benefit of customers. As far as installing more, I know there's talk of installing them in abandoned coal mines and things like that. We should always use our resources as well as we can. So if, abandoned mine lands are lying fallow, we should certainly look at that. But I would also take a harder look at the costs and whether that is truly worth it, especially if that would displace better investment in battery storage technology. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Virginia's energy decisions now, at this time, will impact our health, economy, and the future success of the Commonwealth. And I really appreciate that the public has been invited to be part of this process, so thank you for that. What is most encouraging about the Virginia Energy Plan is its heavy inclusion of renewables. But my primary ask is that Governor Northam adopt a policy of opposition to any new fossil fuel infrastructure, and that this opposition be clearly communicated, implemented, and honored. New fossil fuel infrastructure is not needed to support future energy needs and will accelerate the ruinous impacts of climate change and climate disruption. And all of the above option that includes fracked gas is not acceptable and works against the idea that we are looking forward. It muddies the idea that the administration supports clean energy. We are at a point to embrace the positive impacts of offshore wind with the potential to be the single largest source of clean energy in Virginia. This is a swift action to reduce carbon emissions and to confront the climate crisis. Expanding opportunities for distributed customer-owned solar will also reduce our carbon footprint, bringing health benefits to the state. In today's focus, energy storage is an appropriate solution for backup for wind and solar and would help with preparedness for communities, the communities that bear the impacts of our state government's energy decisions. We must continue to recognize the prohibitive influence of Dominion over our energy policies. It prevents the ability of Virginia to be a true energy leader, a goal that the governor has clearly communicated. The 2018 Virginia Energy Plan must facilitate the ability of Virginians to have autonomy in creating their own electricity. We should not be coerced into new fossil fuel infrastructure, and I again respectfully ask that the administration and the 2018 Energy Plan adopt a policy of opposition to any new fossil fuel infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, and members of the commission. My name is Suzanne Keller. I'm a recently retired public health epidemiologist from the State Health Department, and I've been in my new life now, I'm becoming more of an expert on air pollution and the deleterious effects of using fossil fuels, the harm, the morbidity, and the mortality that it causes in our community, and that we're continuing to add it in Virginia is really disheartening. But about the energy plan. I'm here as a citizen to say we are sick and tired of business as usual, where we have a weak regulatory regime and we have the utilities dominating not only our public discourse, but all of our energy policy. So just one example to illustrate this. When you think about strong regulatory regimes, what state do you think of? California, right? If you look at just looked at an article in Forbes magazine looking at energy efficiency and energy using renewable energy. The state that has the strongest regulations has the companies that do the best. PG&E is number 1 in renewable energy and number 3 in efficiency. In Virginia, where's Dominion? Dominion is 30th in renewable energy and 31st in efficiency. obviously, two areas that state government has a role to play to create a regulatory regime to get Dominion up to 3 or 4 in the rankings. You can do that by implementing stronger policies. I put solar on my house about 6 years ago. I didn't sell my SRECs because I have no interest in just trading carbon. I wanted my contribution, my personal investment, to be one that would benefit our community, not just me, because it really wasn't economically beneficial to me to do it. I hardly used any electricity before I had solar. But I wanted it to be a benefit to the community, to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. So what I would like to see the energy plan do is exponentially increase the amount of distributed solar in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We need regulation and policy that will do that. You know, and everyone in this room knows, and our friend on the phone, that Dominion has been the greatest impediment to distributed solar for decades. Every year we come to the General Assembly and we don't get anywhere because of Dominion. We need more distributed solar. I'm personally against utility-scale solar. Turning our farms, turning landscapes into solar utility-scale projects, while it allows the utilities to maintain control over electricity generation, which is what they want that power, they want that impact to their bottom line. It is not a good use of our land, and you're taking land and turning it into impermeable surface. We've already seen problems in some of the projects in the eastern part of the state with the runoff from these things going right into the rivers. It's like putting a parking lot on a farm and expecting the water not to go downstream. Utility-scale solar makes sense in the desert. It doesn't make sense in a state like Virginia. We're already 8 inches ahead in rainfall this year compared to last year. So I'm really against distributed solar. We need to democratize our energy production. We need to have more distributed solar and net metering in our state. I thank you for listening. And I hope that we can achieve these goals together to make Virginia a real leader in renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm a Chesterfield County resident and a member of Sierra Club. And I would like to, I know this is a little bit unusual for a group that's talking about energy plan for Virginia, but as we move from fossil fuel infrastructure, we need to include plans for the use of bicycles for transportation. In Scandinavian countries, bike lanes have curbs, so cars don't wander over and kill cyclists. Each of you has the ability to use bicycles as part of your means of getting to work. If the infrastructure was there, that would include using, the bike lanes and also having better public transportation so that you can park your bike and ride hopefully an electric bus here. And that's a personal interest of mine. I think bicycling is a lot healthier. It uses our energy. Each of us has the ability to make our way up and down hills with a bicycle and easily get to work and back. We also need to stop dilly-dallying with wind energy. Everybody knows that Dominion has been wasting our time on that. I've read online that they have plans to build 2 experimental turbines off the coast of Virginia Beach. That is laughable. This is not experimental technology. By now, we should have hundreds of turbines out there. Again, go visit the Scandinavian countries. We need to modernize our grid to support clean energy. And I would like to reiterate what other people have said about removing barriers for customer-owned solar. Policies that incentivize greater efficiency standards for new buildings, solar panels on state-owned buildings wherever possible. And I do support the use of hydroelectric storage facilities as long as it's for energy stored from wind and solar, not from fossil fuels. Incentivize the use of electric vehicles. And most important is stop the Mountain Valley Pipeline and the Atlantic Coast pipelines. We need no more fracked gas pipelines. Thank you.
Opportunity to speak. Again, my name is Lee Williams. I am a resident of Richmond, Virginia, and I'm representing the RVA Interfaith Climate Justice League today at the podium. We are concerned about climate change and Virginia's continued dependence on fossil fuels. We have asked elected officials for policies to promote more clean and renewable sources of energy to conserve and protect our environment, while also creating new economic opportunities for solar and wind workers and entrepreneurs in our Commonwealth. I respectfully urge Governor Northam and the DMME to consider the following recommendations as part of the 2018 Energy Plan. Number one, provide incentives for solar coupled with battery storage as a resiliency strategy. Data proves that on-site solar energy together with battery storage is the best way to provide resilient power during extreme weather events. Number two, expand incentives and reduce barriers to customer-owned solar to create well-paying local jobs. 84% of Virginia's solar jobs are in the distributed rooftop solar sector. Rooftop solar and the jobs it creates depend on fair market access and incentives like net metering and third-party ownership. It is hindered by utility-imposed standby charges, arbitrary limits on net metering, and system size limitations. Number three, invest in modernizing our grid. Virginia's truly modern grid will be a two-way energy system that benefits consumers. Advances in rooftop solar, battery storage, and electric vehicles now give energy consumers the ability to actively participate in their energy systems. To create jobs, Virginia needs to expand net metering, third-party ownership, and eliminate unnecessary barriers to customer-owned solar and modernize our grid around clean, renewable energy technology. Unfortunately, Virginia is investing in one of the largest energy infrastructure projects, which would continue the destructive paths of generating and consuming more fossil fuel, while doing little to create good-paying, permanent jobs that will last beyond construction. Our concerns over the two currently proposed pipelines include degradation of water quality and environmental assets, risks to human health and property damage from explosions and methane gas leaks, aggressive use of eminent domain and loss of property value, class and race-based discrepancies in the locations selected for construction, and lack of economic justification for domestic use of fracked gas products. The cost of natural gas power is tethered to the commodity price of natural gas, which is inherently volatile. The price of controllable, storable, renewable energy is tethered only to the technology costs, which are going down. Recent forecasts suggest that it will be cheaper to build new renewable storage than to continue operating existing natural gas plants. Natural gas infrastructure built today will be rendered uncompetitive well before their rated lifespan. They could become stranded assets, saddling utility ratepayers and investors with the costs of premature decommissioning. Because of this forecast, conversations and recommendations for the 2018 Energy Plan must address the risks of natural gas pipelines as well. Thank you for your consideration.
Dr. Susan Miller. I am representing the Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action, which is a group of more than 200 healthcare providers in Virginia, representing various medical specialties that support Virginia's transition to clean, renewable electricity for the protection of public health. We are the state branch of the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which is a new organization formed about 2 years ago, and it includes all of the national organizations that represent physicians in this country. It includes the AMA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Family Physicians, of which I'm a member, the obstetricians, the allergists, the list goes on and on and on. This is an issue that physicians across the country are becoming acutely aware of because we are seeing the impact of climate change in our offices every day. So you wonder, what is it that a physician can add to all these wonderful people that have spoken about new technologies and battery storage and getting the grid modernized? What I'm here to add is that we ask you to be more urgent. It's already happening. We already see people who are experiencing heat illnesses. We already see an extension of the allergy season every year with increasing asthma. We are very aware of people who have experienced extreme weather events. You know, many of us went to Katrina or went to Puerto Rico, et cetera, and we've seen what happens and the impact on children, the disruption of people's lives from these events. And so rather than review again all the wonderful ideas that you've heard, what the physicians would like you to hear is the urgency in our voice that we need to do this now and faster. Thank you.
I worked for electric and gas utilities in other states. I'm very eager to see a modern energy system developed for Virginia. Currently, many of the projects and policies that exist in Virginia will lead us to an increasing energy cost future. We really need to find a way where our utilities and energy companies can benefit while serving the interests of their customers. And right now, that's not the path we're on. As a whole, the energy industry is undergoing a basic shift in how we manage the grid. For over 100 years, we increased generation to match changes in demand. And utility controllers are now looking to alter demand to match changes in generation, turning our entire industry on its head. This is primarily to accommodate the influx of more variable influences like renewables, but it will also lower our cost and clean up the emissions from our generation. So your planning process should accommodate this change. Really, our planning and our policy should lead what happens on the ground instead of following it. For example, this year's IRP from Dominion, although they canceled the last of the combined cycle plants that were planned, there's still 3 to 8 peaking units proposed for the next 15 years, with little attention to storage options. There's reasons for this. They want to cover the variability, but they also want to put things in the rate base. Batteries, which last 4 to 5 hours, for example, the question came up before. I worked with Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. They recently, with the help of Tesla, put a combined solar and battery installation in. Those batteries have a 4-hour life. There's another project underway with that utility with batteries with a 5-hour life. Peaking units typically operate just with a capacity factor of 5 to 10%, a few hours at a time. So the batteries today are competitive with that. They're cheaper. They reduce their price by 50% every 4 to 5 years. So by the time some of these utility peaking units would go into service, batteries will be half again, maybe a quarter of today's current price. We can also avoid the risk of overbuilding. We've had an over-optimistic forecast for load growth in this region for a long time. When you add things in small increments, you can really follow what's happening as opposed to trying to guess and then perhaps paying too much or building too much that the ratepayers end up paying for. And it also deals with the rising gas prices. In the IRP's Dominion has forecast that our gas price 10 to 15 years from now will be 2 to 3 times what it is today. So for the typical gas plant, that will increase the cost of its energy produced by 50 to 100%. So we've really built out our system here quite a bit in the past few years. Greensville will come on later this year. But those plants will get increasingly costly, which means higher costs to the citizens of Virginia. The other benefits of batteries is that you can get other services like frequency and voltage control, and they act like virtual power plants. They can actually replace those peaking units, plus provide other services. The real benefit that they can provide that the peakers can't is as we get more solar generation, not just in Virginia, but it's happening all throughout PJM. PJM said they can increase renewables by 30% before we really have to make significant expenditures to upgrade the grid. Solar generates energy at zero marginal cost, right? You've already paid for it. So the more it generates, that next unit is free, essentially. So you want your energy system to be able to use as much of that as possible. What the batteries do is soak it up when it's there, and then it shifts its use to later in the day. The evening peaks occur when people go home from work, so the work's still winding down and the homes are gearing up. That's when our peak usage is. So by taking the sunshine when it's at its peak in the day, storing it for a few hours, and then releasing it when it's most needed, that's the way to best manage the grid. And also, what we're finding out in the modern grid, that smaller pieces distributed throughout the distribution system have much more value. Resiliency, reliability, frequency and voltage control, but really to also avoid the cost of having to build more distribution or transmission lines to avoid congestion. That's a big deal with PJM and our utilities, okay? By distributing it with solar, for example, which was brought up earlier, you really save a lot of those costs. So we need to look at a balance of utility, solar generation, and solar distributed amongst our residential customer and consumer and industrial users. The projections are that by 2022, that we will have as much storage at those customer locations as we will out in the utility scale grid. That's a huge shift. So we need to make sure that we have the policies in place to allow that. And how do we pay that? How do we manage that? For example, do we allow third-party aggregators to use their customers and bid into a PJM marketplace for that storage? That discussion's underway right now, and Virginia needs to take part in that properly. As EVs come on, the utilities have talked about EVs as a great nighttime load to help use the energy from, excess energy from the nuclear plants. But many people are looking at it differently. What the EVs can do, one is they provide a cheap battery source, right? You already paid for the batteries when you bought the car, but you don't use the car all day long. So that surplus zero-cost solar energy in peak sunshine time can be put into the batteries of EVs, parked at home, parked at work, wherever it may be. And they could then either be used as fuel or released back into the grid when it's most needed. It also, well, let me deal with this. We're making a lot of energy policy decisions right now, assuming that those nuclear plants will be renewed for their 60th to 80th year of operation. one of the assumptions, for example, is the new pump storage plant that's talked about. And I'm sure the people that have proposed that, especially to help the challenging conditions in Southwest Virginia, are very sincere about how this might help. But at the cost that's been proposed, the rest of Virginia will really have to pay a lot to make that happen. It's a much more expensive way of storage. It's less efficient. It's in the wrong place, far from the service territory. And just like utility-scale solar, the transmission required to connect it to everything else, to make those facilities functional, aren't included in the project price. But the ratepayers still have to pay for it. So let's just take the $2 billion projected cost for that project right now. If the utility builds a project that costs $2 billion, the ratepayers are required to repay that utility about $8 billion over the financial life of that facility. So we're looking at an $8 billion investment where we could have much cheaper, much more flexible, providing us a much more resilient energy system if we had smaller chunks with technology that's decreasing in cost by 50% every 4 to 5 years instead of probably getting more expensive. This goes back to the nuclear issue, because the Bath County facility, 3,000 megawatts there, 2,000 of it controlled by Dominion, it could begin to lose its value in the early 2030s. The estimate for renewing those plants right now is $4 billion. Again, that's $16 billion that would have to be repaid by the ratepayers. I worked on a number of nuclear projects. The first number you hear is never the one that ends up costing, right? It's usually multiples of that, but let's just work from the $4 billion number. So $16 billion of investment. Merchant nuclear plants. Merchant plants are plants that are only dictated by the market. Let's say if they were in PJM, they get paid for the capacity marketplace and they get paid for the energy marketplace. Same as Dominion's plants and APCO's plants do, okay? But in Virginia, we also have, let's call them ratepayer subsidies, okay? Because not only do those plants get paid by the marketplace, the original investment gets repaid, the entire cost of the financing gets repaid, and the rate of return on that investment gets repaid. And if it's in the 10% base rate, or like 9.6%, which is in the Greensville RAC, that is approximately twice the amount of the original investment that goes back to the utility in profit. Okay? So when we hear these numbers, and I want to wrap up here. I want to talk to these other issues maybe in Roanoke, but things like if the utility does energy efficiency, if the utility does solar, multiply those numbers by 4. That's what the ratepayer has to pay for. In other states that are trying to develop modern energy systems, for example, they're not allowing utilities to put solar in the rate base. They can participate like anybody else, but they do it on an even playing field, okay? That keeps the price of modern technologies down. So what do you have to do? You have to find a different way to have our utilities prosper, doing what's good for their customers. We're really getting out of alignment. We've got a lot of policies that are getting more money back to the utility, which is costing the families and businesses and Virginia's economy more in the long run. And I'm sure that's not where you want to go. You're trying to find a way where our energy companies can prosper in a way that helps our citizens and the state prosper. And many of the things that are underway right now aren't leading us there. Thank you.
Taylor, my last name. I'm an intern with the Sierra Club. I'm from Roanoke, Virginia, and I'm a rising senior at University of Richmond. I'm currently the president of University of Richmond's student-led environmental organization, Green UR. I've worked closely with our sustainability director to advocate for an increased sustainable and environmentally friendly practices across campus.
Now we have a new rooftop solar installation on campus, and we're planning on installing another off-site solar farm in Pittsylvania County to increase our solar storage and usage. As a student who has seen the benefits of renewable energy here in Richmond, and as a soon-to-be graduate who will see the initial results of your energy plan in her young adult life, I ask that you push for more renewable energy options such as solar and wind, and work to oppose dirty, non-renewable energy practices across Virginia. Thank you.